Hi, what's your name?
My name's Stephanie Adams.
Hey Stephanie, how are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. So you are homeless, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you are currently living in Merced?
Yes, I am.
And how long have you been homeless in Merced?
About 5.5 years.
And how was your childhood?
My childhood was, I was born in Ohio. My parents split when I was about 3.5 and moved to Southern California. A couple years past that, my mom remarried and I acquired siblings who weren't very nice. I have my own two siblings. I had two brothers already, and so there was a total of 5 of us. There was abuse in the house from the siblings, pretty much. My parents were, they were all right. So.
What kind of abuse? Physical, mental?
All of that, pretty much.
And did your parents know?
So they were somewhat like I spanked. I mean, I don't know if that's considered abuse. Sometimes it's just considered discipline, but never like beat or anything. But the siblings were pretty harsh, yeah.
And were they brothers and sisters, or?
Yes.
So other than the abuse from your siblings and discipline from your parents, did you suffer any other type of abuse from other people?
Yes, I did. The abuse from my stepbrother was sexual or the molestation type, and so that affected me apparently to the point where I started gaining weight at that age. I didn't realize the connection until I was in my 30s getting therapy about it, and I guess my body's way of protecting itself from future molestation, and I guess it worked because it did eventually stop. But that, of course, when you're the fat kid, you're abused at school, and so there was that abuse too. And one thing I was never taught growing up was it doesn't matter what other people think, and to me everything mattered. How I got my value from how you thought of me. What you thought of me is how I got my value.
Did you have low self-esteem?
Yes. Okay. Not to say that my childhood was all bad. I mean, I had good times. I was the baby in the family. There was a lot of summers at the great aunt and uncles, and in Southern California, and I had good times. It wasn't all bad. I didn't have terribly low self-esteem. I would hear things from the adults like, well, as soon as she discovers boys, she'll lose the weight, or I'd hear people say, and they didn't think I heard them, she has such a pretty face, if only she'd lose weight. And so the big focus in my life growing up was losing weight. I had to lose weight to fit in. And so eventually that's what led to using.
When did you start using? At what age?
The first time I took anything, it would have been probably at age 4, and that was just sipping on wine, like on my uncle's lap. There's a picture of me with a wine glass, and I just can't imagine somebody giving a 4-year-old or whatever age that was wine, but I can remember not liking the taste, but wanting more. And eventually, alcohol was abused, and that was probably about age 12. I probably started drinking, a little more. The drugs kicked in probably about 15, 16, and it was marijuana, and then cocaine, and then eventually crank, which is now meth, I guess.
So your uncle had introduced you to alcohol?
Well, pretty much everybody. I guess my father was an alcoholic, but I don't really remember much about him from when I lived in Ohio. I don't remember really any of that. And I guess he was really abusive to my mother, so I'm sure I saw and heard a lot of it, but I don't remember any of that. It was really weird to ever hear like my parents, as in my stepfather and my mother, argue. I can remember the first time I heard them fight, I cried because I wasn't used to hearing that. It was just kind of a scary thing. But eventually I wound up getting in those type of relationships, like the one that my mother first had with my real father. So I wound up getting with abusive alcoholics, it seems.
So once you started using marijuana and coke and other drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Were you doing them by yourself, or were you doing them with a group of friends and family?
I was doing it with my friends. Anything that my siblings, my older siblings, were doing, except for my stepbrother, of course. I wanted to be just like my older sister. We have the same names. Her name is also Stephanie, and it's kind of a trip because we had the same middle name. And when my mother married her father, I took on their last name. So we, two of us, with the same exact name growing up. So I was little Stephanie. She's big Stephanie. And anyways, I wanted to be just like her, and she didn't want me doing it, and I didn't know at the time that she resented me, actually, period. I just was excited to have a sister, after having brothers only growing up. And so I eventually used with my siblings, but they wouldn't do it with me until I'd already done it.
So your stepsister resented you. Did your stepbrother resent you as well?
Well, like I said, he had molested me for, a couple of years probably, and maybe not even that long, but he didn't resent me. He was about 7 years older than me, and so he was out of the house not long after, within a few years after my parents married. He had moved out. So I don't think he resented me, but just the sister. And I should also mention my sister and my brother, my stepsister and my brother, just a few months apart. So they became very close. And, I was kind of jealous of that myself. But again, I was just excited to have a sister. And anything they did, I wanted to be a part of. And eventually, I did get to be a part of, at least with my brother, again.
And did your stepfather and your mother ever find out that your stepbrother was molesting you?
It came out in a bad way. I blurted it out at a time when I was probably in trouble, trying to take the focus off of me. And I said, well, if this hadn't happened to me as a child, then... And so I never really got to tell her. I told my sister about it, probably in my teens, and she cried about it, and she never cries. So that was a big deal, to find out that her brother had done that to me, and it bothered her. Eventually I told his daughter, even, because I didn't want to, he had daughters, and I didn't want anything like that to happen. When his daughter was about 15, I told her. But yeah.
Do you think that those years of molestation changed you in any way, or changed your mindset?
Some women, when it happens to them, they hate men, or some go the other direction. Even though I guess my body was trying to protect itself from him, I liked boys. I wasn't ready for that type of liking. But I can remember, again, the whole focus was losing weight, being pretty, and getting a boyfriend. And so, when the time was right, which was about 15, 16, that's what that's all I looked for. Because I had, my best friends were twins, and they were gorgeous. And so there's a little competition going there. So definitely had to step up my game. And that's why the using of crank, kicked in. And that was just actually short-lived. That wasn't my drug of choice back then. I didn't like how it made me feel. I just liked the fact that I didn't eat and lost weight and got that attention that I'd been looking for.
What was your drug of choice?
Way back then, probably cocaine. I like to smoke coke.
And have you tried other drugs?
Pretty much everything else. Pretty much, yeah. Just later in life, I tried, heroin and things. My sister was very clear on one thing. We don't use needles, and we don't do heroin. And come to find out, well, because she had used needles and did heroin and didn't want to see me go through that. So even though she might have resented me, she had some care at one point in time for me and was trying to look out for me and didn't want me to go through, I guess, what she went through. But she's a functional type user. She would pain would kick in and she would just stop and, be responsible again. Whereas I would just keep going until everything fell apart, lose job after job and things like that.
So your stepsister was a functional addict and you weren't and aren't?
Yeah, I'm not a functional addict. Definitely, I could be doing. I'm doing the bare minimum with my life right now. I stepped it up because I didn't see myself 5 years ago still being here, and to hear somebody else, speak on that they were homeless 7 years, it just blew my mind. I couldn't imagine that, and like I'd shared with you before, people would plan their year around when to go to the shelter because you could only go so many months a year or something like that, and I would think you're still going to be homeless then, because I wasn't going to be homeless for this long, but being an addict, I've had some little windfalls here and there, and I just lived on that money, like whatever I wanted at that time I had. Whether motels are expensive, so that was definitely one of the expensive things, but instead of housing. But the whole housing thing is really difficult. It's a challenge for me right now.
So off camera you had mentioned that there was years at a time that you had been clean. Tell me a little bit about the years of you being clean and having jobs.
Okay, well, pretty much most of my life, and my teens, from 16 all the way until I was pregnant with my first son at 22. I worked a lot of temping jobs. I used during that until I was pregnant, and I did clean up, and then after I planned on, I would experience my first meetings, like AA or NA, to try to make sure I stayed clean once I had my son, but unfortunately it didn't stick. That was that's when the consequences weren't great at that time, as far as, well, legal consequences tend to be the most effective for me. Being forced into a program is not a bad thing, because that's really when I've been serious about it, because loss of freedom is huge for me, and loss of if I had to lose my child or something, that would be huge for me. Unfortunately, I did wind up losing my first to his father. He got clean before me, but we have a relationship, and it's not like I lost him entirely, he wasn't adopted out or something like that, but his father raised him, and I visited. And the getting clean, eventually when I got pregnant with my second son, I was in a program actually when that happened, and so I was clean when I had him also, but again I started getting high afterwards, and it wasn't until my youngest was 3.5 that I picked up a felony case for drugs, and here in Merced, and that was back in 2000. And it took 3 attempts at a program. Actually, it was the 4th attempt that it finally stuck. And it was a matter of, well, you're not going to get your child. I actually asked CPS for help because I had a hard time with having my son in the program. And then his father passed away when I went to another program. And that was just, it was a voluntary CPS in the beginning. And then they kicked me out, said that I wasn't willing to change, even though I had so many challenges. I lost my son's father on my 5th day in that one program, and at the 70th day they kicked me out, and so then I was violated by the probation and had to go to jail. And so then my son was legally detained by CPS, even though he was already in foster care voluntarily. There was no more voluntary. I either do this program and do it right, or I lose my son, and I did it, and I didn't have to keep going. I don't know what possessed me, but I continued that for a couple years, and I think again, caring what people think. I have a dear friend who shared with me. She said that I went from 0 to hero, and I love that. I love that she said that, and it made me feel so good. I just kept going, and I was working for the first time, clean and sober, being a parent, a single parent, I even though I have two boys, it's like they were raised separately, 6 years apart, and in different households. But I love, being a mom, even though I did it all alone. I really didn't have any help from family or friends or anything. But most of my friends were in the Bay Area, and I was in Merced. But eventually, I left Merced, went to Sacramento, got better jobs. I did really well for several years. Eventually, even though I wasn't using meth anymore, my addiction then turned to food. And so then I had weight loss surgery, and so my addiction said, well, now what are we going to do? So even though I didn't really think of myself as an alcoholic prior to this, I began drinking heavily, and within a year was a full-blown alcoholic. And that was, I went into recovery on my own, stopped my job, took time off for FMLA, they'll hold your job for you. And I did that voluntarily, and I got a whole year under my belt. And about a year after that, even though I didn't really drink much after that, I started smoking weed or something. There was something always missing, and so I always had to put something in to feel better, and I don't know why that is. So even though I seemed to have it together, I moved to Sacramento, and I had my drinking phase or whatever. What did me in, I think, in the end, was my mother had moved back from Ohio, where we're from, and we bought a house together, and this was about 2 years into my job, and a year after that I lost my job. And I loved my job. This was my first job that I'd ever held for a whole 3 years, which was a really big deal. And it wasn't because of drinking or using. It was more of a personality conflict with the last boss that I had. So I was devastated by that. And financially, I was okay when I left the job because I had, a decent disability package. And I was actually taken off of work after getting fired, if that makes any sense. But I really let that get to me to the point where I started using like pills and you name it, whatever I could do to not feel bad anymore. And it was at that point in time that my husband who had once been my boyfriend in high school, came into my life, and we had like this, a couple years of, maybe about a year before we started using, and we went, right back into meth. Unfortunately, that I wasn't going to be able to keep the house, just based on the fact that income, the loss of income. My mother and I couldn't afford it. But eventually the using is what caused us to lose the rental that we had to get after losing our house. And having to move back to Merced was a financial matter, because we weren't taking care of business, and my husband's using sent him in a mental state that it was not healthy for my mother to be around, or my son, or me for that matter. And so we wound up coming to Merced, and I insisted that he get clean and sober before he tries to join us, because he was the problem. But that we wound up coming to Merced, and eventually my husband joined us, and we took care of my mother another maybe year and a half, and then she passed away. And we would have probably been out of that rental if it hadn't been like about 6 weeks after my mom passed away. My husband got hurt in the house that we were renting on stairs that we had told them to fix, because I was so afraid my mom would go down those stairs and get hurt. And they didn't fix it. And we sued them. We were suing them, in the process of suing the owner and the landlord, the management company. And then they retaliated by not doing anything. So whenever I would report anything, they would argue with me about it and say, like, we caused it or something. And they never did fix the stairs. So eventually, after about another year or so of that, I withheld rent. And so, of course, then they served us with an eviction. And I fought it, It was actually only me and my mother on the lease to begin with. So in the end, it was just me that went to court, and the judge didn't want to hear anything about, any kind of escrow account or, did we. All he cared about was, if you don't want to pay your rent, then you're not going to live here. So they won the eviction. Eventually, we won in the legal matter for my husband's injuries, but it was nothing near what it should have been. And so that was about five years ago, about this same time, 5 years ago. And
so after all that happened, you ended up in a tent in Merced.
Right.
And you said you've been here homeless for about 5 years, correct?
Correct. And it hasn't actually been in a tent all this time. For the first 3 of those years, my husband and I were in my van, and just going from different, park to park, or wherever we could park. Eventually, him and I split up, and I just recently lost the van. I wound up having to sell it. I didn't stay current on the registration, and it was also having problems that eventually, I couldn't afford to fix, and the tickets were too great. So I just recently let it go. So now it's the tent, and it's a great tent.
It is. I like it. It's
Thank
nice,
you. It's got a
and
closet.
Spacey.
Yes, it is.
And so now that you're in a tent, where do you see yourself going?
Well, the reason why I'm currently in a tent versus there is a shelter here, and right around the corner, a brand spanking new navigation center. There are rules that you have to follow to stay in those. I've been doing the shelter thing for a couple years, about 2.5, 3 years, and the plan has been all along, to get housed. Even with the challenges that are in front of me, I've been working with different organizations that help with those challenges. And now that I'm alone, ever since my husband and I split up, well, he qualified for certain things because he's already disabled, and whereas I am in the process of getting mine. Unless if you already have Social Security, you're kind of like in with some of these programs, whereas I still have that fight. I'm still fighting for my Social Security. I am disabled. I have many issues, physical, mental, that make it very difficult to work or to keep a job for sure. And so that's where I'm at right now, is just getting the medical proof to the organization, specifically Sierra Saving Grace, and really hoping that they'll be able to find some place for me to rent, because the program that I'm currently in, they are the people that would be on the lease, and then they're subleasing to me, and it's a great opportunity, but there's just no real housing available. There's too many people that need it, and there just needs to be a lot more. They need to build a lot more affordable housing. And anyways, back to the navigation center and the shelter. I recently was kicked out. I've been kicked out of the navigation center 4 times. Never the shelter. I've only left voluntarily. And there's a lot of things that happen in that center that should be discussed in a whole nother interview. And I'd love to talk about that some other time. But that's a place that I will hopefully be going to in a few days, because my punishment is almost over for the crime that I committed there, or the violation that I committed, whatever you want to say. And hopefully I'll be going back there next week. And so the tent, maybe I'll rent that out.
That's a good side hustle.
Yeah.
So are you currently still using?
Yes, I am. Not at this very moment, but yes, I do still use. I could see myself getting clean in the future, but it's so difficult to get off methamphetamines because of the depression. I already have those issues of depression and anxiety and different disorders and whatnot, but The depression is so great that I feel better, on it than trying to come off of it. But I know that in the end, coming off of it and being functional is what's going to probably save me.
It definitely will save you. Where do you see yourself in 5 years from now?
Maybe the Bahamas. Seychelles. I'd like to be in the island of Seychelles.
And if any younger generation people are watching this, or your parents and your family, what would you like to say to them?
Doesn't matter what people think. It matters what you think. And you're fine just the way you are. You don't have to be a certain way. That's probably the message that I wished I would have gotten. And I'm trying to be okay with me now. And as a matter of fact, my name is Donn Marie Dubois, and I said my name was something else because of the shame attached to, being homeless and not being where I should be in my life. And, I didn't want people that knew me growing up to look down on me, but this is what I am today. And I'm fine just the way I am. I can improve in some areas of my life, but I am okay.
Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you.